The 19th century was an age of iron and steam, of revolution and empire. It was a time when old maps were torn apart and redrawn by the force of will, the roar of cannons, and the intricate dance of diplomacy. In the heart of Europe, a new power was rising, forged not in the gentle salons of artists and philosophers, but in the fiery crucible of the barracks and the cold, calculating mind of the statesman. This power was Prussia. At the center of this world-shaking transformation stood colossal figures, men whose names have become synonymous with the era. There was Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, a political genius of ruthless ambition who would unite Germany with blood and iron. There was his master, Wilhelm I, the soldier king, a man who seemed carved from Prussian granite, embodying the old virtues of duty, discipline, and divine right. And there was the tragic crown prince, Frederick III, the hope of liberals, a gentle soul in a warrior's kingdom, whose destiny would be cruelly cut short. Their stories are the stuff of legend. We see them in statues, read about them in textbooks, and analyze their every move. But history is never just the story of great men. It is also the story of those who stand beside them in the shadows of their thrones, whose lives and influence are often overlooked. This is the story of one such figure, a woman born at the very epicenter of this political earthquake, whose life was a quiet but profound counterpoint to the thunderous ambitions of the men who surrounded her. She was the daughter of the first German emperor, the sister of the tragic liberal Hope, and the aunt of the volatile Kaiser who would lead the world into cataclysm. Her name was Princess Louise of Prussia, later the Grand Duchess of Baden. When we hear the phrase, a 19th century princess in a political marriage, our minds conjure a familiar Gothic image. We picture a life of gilded misery, a cold and loveless union, a woman sacrificed for a treaty, destined to live out her days in lonely, melancholic splendor. Many have assumed this was Louise's fate. Historians focused on the grand sweep of German unification have often painted her with this brush, depicting her as a minor character in a tragic play, a footnote in the story of her more famous relatives. But what if that portrait is wrong? What if the quietness of her life was not emptiness, but fulfillment? What if behind the stern, formal facade of a Prussian princess beat the heart of a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a pioneering humanitarian? What if her story is not one of tragedy, but one of resilience, of finding deep and lasting happiness where none was expected, and of wielding a different kind of power, not the power of armies, but the power of compassion? Today we begin a journey to uncover the true story of Louise. We will peel back the layers of myth and misconception to reveal the woman behind the title. This is not a fairy tale, nor is it a simple tragedy. It is something far more complex and far more human. The story of a life lived with grace, strength, and quiet purpose in the very eye of the historical storm. This is the story of the girl in the shadow of the throne. To understand Louise, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that forged her. Mid-19th century Prussia was a kingdom of stark and often brutal contradictions. On one hand, it was the most dynamic and rapidly industrializing state in Germany. Railways crisscrossed its territories. Factories sprouted in the Ruhr Valley, and its universities were centers of scientific and philosophical innovation. A new, educated, and ambitious middle class was rising, filled with a fervent desire for national unity and liberal reform. They dreamed of a unified Germany, a Deutschland, that would be a beacon of constitutional government, freedom, and cultural achievement. This dream had flared into brilliant, fiery life during the revolutions of 1848, a year when ordinary people across Europe rose up to demand their rights. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the old order of absolute monarchs and landed aristocrats would be swept away, but the flame was extinguished. In Prussia, the revolution was crushed with military force, and the old guard reasserted its control with grim determination. This brings us to the other side of Prussia, the world of the Junkers. This was the powerful, conservative landed aristocracy of Eastern Prussia, a class that valued loyalty, military honor, and tradition above all else. For the Junkers, liberalism was a disease, parliaments were a nuisance, and the army was the true soul of the nation. The king was not a servant of the people. He was God's anointed ruler, and the army was his sacred instrument. This was the Prussia of discipline, of hierarchy, of unquestioning obedience. It was a state, as the saying went, that was not a country with an army, but an army with a country. Louise was born into the absolute heart of this second dominant Prussia. Her family was the House of Hohenzollern, the dynasty that had, through centuries of shrewdness and military might, transformed the minor electorate of Brandenburg into a major European power. The court in Berlin and at the royal palaces in Potsdam was not a place of frivolity or artistic experimentation. It was cold, formal, and overwhelmingly military in its character and daily rhythm. Life was governed by rigid etiquette, the day punctuated by the sound of marching boots and military parades. It was a world where a man's worth was measured by the uniform he wore and the rank he held, and a woman's worth was measured by the strategic value of her marriage. Into this world on December 3rd, 1838, Louise Marie Elizabeth was born. She was the second child and only daughter of Prince Wilhelm of Prussia and his wife, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. At the time of her birth, her father was second in line to the throne, living in the shadow of his older brother, the childless King Frederick William IV. No one knew then that this stern second son would one day become the first emperor of a united Germany. To his family, he was simply a soldier, through and through. Wilhelm I was the epitome of the old Prussian ideal. His personality had been forged in the Napoleonic Wars, and he saw the world in simple, stark terms: order and chaos, duty and dereliction, loyalty and treason. He was deeply conservative, profoundly pious, and possessed an unshakable belief in the divine right of kings. During the 1848 revolutions, his ruthless determination to crush the uprisings in Berlin earned him the infamous nickname Kartätschen Prince, the grape-shot prince, forcing him to flee to England for a time. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was emotionally reserved to the point of coldness, viewing sentimentality as a dangerous weakness. He loved his children, but his love was expressed through a rigid insistence on duty and discipline, not through warmth or open affection. He was a father to be respected and obeyed, not a friend to be confided in. If Prince Wilhelm was the rock of Prussian conservatism, his wife Augusta was the flowing river of Weimar liberalism. Their marriage was one of the most famously mismatched and unhappy royal unions of the century. Augusta hailed from the small but culturally brilliant court of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, which, under the patronage of her ancestors, had become the intellectual heart of Germany. This was the home of Goethe and Schiller, the birthplace of the literary movement of Weimar classicism. Augusta grew up in a world of art, music, literature, and vibrant intellectual debate. She was intelligent, well-read, artistically inclined, and possessed of liberal political sympathies. From the moment she arrived in Berlin as a young bride, she felt like a caged bird. She found the Prussian court stifling, its militaristic obsession boorish, and its intellectual life a barren wasteland. She despised the powerful conservative faction, and they in turn distrusted her as a dangerous foreign liberal. The great love of her life had been a man she was not allowed to marry, and she had accepted Wilhelm out of a sense of duty. The emotional and intellectual chasm between them was immediate and unbridgeable. Wilhelm found her intellectualism pretentious and her emotional displays tiresome. She found his soldierly simplicity dull and his conservatism oppressive. They lived in a state of polite, frigid distance for over 60 years, bound by duty but separated by everything that truly mattered to them. Their home, the Neue Palais in Potsdam, was a magnificent palace filled with emotional frost. This was the environment that shaped Princess Louise. She grew up navigating the treacherous emotional landscape between a father who demanded duty and a mother who craved affection and intellectual connection. It was an education in contradiction. From her father, she learned the ironclad Hohenzollern principles of responsibility, self-sacrifice, and service to the state. She understood from her earliest days that her life was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. From her mother, however, she inherited a sensitivity of spirit, a love for culture, and a deep-seated compassion that was often at odds with the harsh realities of the Prussian court. Her closest companion, her only real ally in this challenging childhood, was her brother Frederick, known affectionately as Fritz, who was 7 years her senior. Fritz was his mother's son in spirit. He was intelligent, sensitive, and had a natural aversion to the blood and iron mentality that dominated his father's world. He and Louise formed an incredibly tight bond, a pact of mutual support against the cold formality of their father and the constant simmering unhappiness of their mother. They would share books, discuss ideas, and confide their hopes and fears in one another. In Fritz, Louise found the warmth and understanding that was otherwise so lacking in her life. This bond would endure throughout their lives, a source of immense comfort, and later, of profound sorrow. Louise's education was meticulously planned, designed to create the perfect royal consort. She became fluent in French and English, studied history and the arts, and was trained in the intricate rules of court etiquette. But under her mother's influence, her education went deeper. She developed a genuine appreciation for art and music and, most importantly, an awareness of the world outside the palace walls. Augusta, frustrated in her own ambitions, instilled in her daughter a sense of social conscience, a belief that privilege came with the responsibility to care for those less fortunate. And so the young princess grew into a complex young woman. On the surface, she was everything a Hohenzollern princess was supposed to be: dignified, dutiful, and impeccably behaved. But beneath that controlled exterior was a keen intelligence, a deep well of emotion, and a yearning for a life of genuine purpose and connection. She had seen firsthand, in her own parents' marriage, how duty without love could curdle into a lifetime of quiet misery. She knew her own marriage would be a political arrangement, a move on the great chessboard of German politics. She was prepared to do her duty as her father had taught her. The question that must have haunted her youthful dreams was whether she could find a way to reconcile that duty with the hopes for a warmer, more meaningful life that her mother had nurtured within her. As she entered her late teens, the answer to that question would soon arrive, in the form of a proposal from a southern German state called Baden. As Princess Louise approached her 18th birthday, the abstract concept of dynastic duty began to take on a concrete and imminent form. The political gears of Europe were turning, and her future was a vital cog in the great machine Prussia was building. The question of her marriage was not a matter of romance, but of realpolitik, the pragmatic, often ruthless politics of power. The gaze of the Berlin court and of Louise's father, Prince Wilhelm, turned southward to the Grand Duchy of Baden. The suitor was Frederick, the Prince Regent. 12 years Louise's senior, he was a man who had been thrust into power not by ambition, but by tragedy. His older brother, Grand Duke Ludwig II, suffered from mental illness, rendering him unfit to rule. In 1852, Frederick had assumed the regency, bearing the full weight of the state on his shoulders. He was known throughout the German states as a man of profound seriousness, integrity, and, most importantly, of moderately liberal convictions. He was not a typical Prussian Junker. His character had been shaped by the more cosmopolitan and enlightened traditions of Baden. The House of Zeringen, his family line, was one of the oldest and most respected in Germany, with a long history of patronizing the arts and sciences and championing a more constitutional form of government. Frederick himself had studied at the universities of Heidelberg and Bonn, not just at a military academy. He believed in progress, in law, and in the responsibility of a ruler to his people. He presented a stark contrast to the rigid, autocratic world of the Berlin court, embodying a different vision for Germany's future, one based on a federation of states, not on Prussian domination. For Prussia, however, this was precisely what made the match so strategically brilliant. Baden was a crucial middle power in the fractured German Confederation. Geographically, it was vital, nestled along the Rhine, sharing a long and vulnerable border with France. Politically, it was a prize. Traditionally, the southern German states, culturally Catholic and wary of Prussian ambition, had looked to Austria for leadership. An alliance with Baden, cemented by the marriage of the future King of Prussia's only daughter, would be a monumental coup. It would create a powerful Protestant-led axis running from the northeast to the southwest, drive a wedge into Austrian influence, and secure a critical ally for Prussia's ultimate goal, the unification of Germany under a Hohenzollern crown. For Louise, the proposal must have been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. There was the weight of filial duty, the understanding that this was her primary function as a princess. There was the profound sadness of leaving her home, her parents, and especially her beloved brother, Fritz. Yet, there may have been a quiet glimmer of hope. In Frederick of Baden, she was not being matched with a grizzled reactionary general, but with a thoughtful, respected ruler whose political leanings mirrored the more liberal ideals of her mother and brother. Perhaps, just perhaps, duty did not have to mean misery. Perhaps in the sunny vineyards of Baden, she might find a kinder, more fulfilling existence than the one offered in the cold quarters of Potsdam. The decision, of course, was never truly hers. It was made for her in the studies of ministers and the chambers of the royal palace. In 1854, the betrothal was formally announced. The 17-year-old princess was now promised to the 30-year-old regent of Baden. The 2 years between the betrothal and the wedding were a period of careful preparation. Louise was groomed for her future role as Grand Duchess, while diplomats and courtiers worked out the intricate details of the marriage contract and the ceremonies that would surround it. Finally, in the autumn of 1856, the time came. The wedding, held on September 20th, was a magnificent display of Hohenzollern power and prestige. The ceremony took place in the chapel of the Neue Palais in Potsdam, the sprawling Baroque palace where Louise had spent her childhood. Royalty and nobility from across the German states and beyond gathered to witness the union. The air was thick with the scent of incense and candle wax, the light glittering off polished military decorations and priceless family jewels. Louise was, by all accounts, a vision of youthful dignity. She walked the aisle on the arm of her father, her expression composed, embodying the ideal of the dutiful daughter. but one can only imagine the torrent of emotion beneath the calm surface, the solemnity of the vows, the weight of the crown she would one day wear, the heart-wrenching finality of this step. The ceremony was the public seal on a political pact. Yet, it was in the more private moments that the true emotional cost and significance of the day were felt. The farewells were undoubtedly the most difficult. Her relationship with her mother Augusta had always been complex, a mixture of love, sympathy, and the friction caused by her mother's own unhappiness. But now, as her daughter prepared to leave, Augusta must have seen both a reflection of her own past and a hope for a better future for Louise. The most poignant farewell was certainly with her brother Fritz. They had been each other's anchor in the often chilly world of the Prussian court. His marriage a few years prior to Victoria, Princess Royal of Great Britain, a famously intelligent and liberal woman, had only strengthened their shared worldview. In a letter, Fritz would later write of his deep affection for his sister and his genuine hope for her happiness. As they embraced, it was not a prince and princess saying goodbye, but a brother and sister, promising to remain each other's confidants across the miles that would now separate them. Following the festivities, the young couple began their journey south. It was a progress, a formal tour that introduced the new princess to her people. At every stop, they were greeted by cheering crowds, cannon salutes, and local dignitaries. For the people of Baden, this was a momentous occasion. Their ruler was bringing home a Prussian princess, the daughter of the man who would likely one day be the most powerful monarch in Germany. This marriage elevated their status, binding their small grand duchy to the rising star of the north. When Louise finally arrived in the capital, Karlsruhe, she was greeted with a city transformed by celebration. It was here that her new life would truly begin. The court she entered was immediately different from the one she had left behind. While Berlin was defined by its rigid military ethos, Karlsruhe was a city of refined classicism, its architecture and culture bearing the more graceful influence of nearby France. The atmosphere was less formal, the intellectual life more vibrant. It was a court where art and science were prized, a place much more akin to her mother's beloved Weimar than her father's Spartan Berlin. For a young woman who had grown up between those two poles, it must have felt like a homecoming of the spirit. The world expected the marriage of Louise and Frederick to be a model of political decorum, respectful, formal, and emotionally distant. History, however, had a surprise in store. The union that began as a calculated political strategy slowly, quietly blossomed into a deep and enduring partnership. This was not a passionate whirlwind romance. It was something perhaps more durable, a connection built on a foundation of profound mutual respect that gradually warmed into genuine affection and love. Frederick, for his part, quickly discovered that his young wife was far more than just a pretty princess. He found in her a sharp intellect, a formidable strength of will, and a steadfast sense of duty that matched his own. He came to rely on her judgment and valued her as his closest advisor. He gave her the space and encouragement to develop her own interests, a sign of remarkable trust and progressive thinking for a husband of that era. Louise, in turn, found in Frederick the stability and kindness she had craved. He was not a cold soldier like her father, nor was he consumed by the restless unhappiness that plagued her mother. He was a good, decent man, wholly dedicated to his responsibilities and to her welfare. In the security of his affection, she thrived. The guarded young princess began to open up, revealing a warmth and compassion that had been kept under wraps in the restrictive environment of the Prussian court. The most telling evidence of this unexpected happiness comes from Louise's own pen. In a letter to a dear friend, she wrote with an almost astonished joy, "Since we last saw one another, My life has become so much more beautiful, so much more precious to me. My happiness is so much richer and deeper than before." These are not the words of a woman resigned to a miserable fate. They are the words of a wife who has found a home, not just in a new land, but in her husband's heart. Their compatibility was evident in the life they built together. They both disliked the endless ceremony and intrigue of the main court in Karlsruhe. Their true sanctuary was their summer residence on the picturesque island of Mano in Lake Constance. Here, surrounded by stunning gardens and the serene waters of the lake, they could set aside the trappings of royalty and live something approaching a normal family life. They would walk the gardens, read together, and raise their children away from the prying eyes of the court. Their family soon began to grow. Their firstborn son and heir, Frederick, arrived in 1857. He was followed by a daughter, Victoria, in 1862, and another son, Ludwig Wilhelm, in 1865. Louise proved to be a devoted and loving mother, determined to provide her children with the warmth and emotional security that had been so absent in her own childhood. The people of Baden quickly grew to adore their new Grand Duchess. They saw her not as an aloof Prussian import, but as a dedicated mother and a compassionate sovereign who took a genuine interest in their welfare. The couple was famously popular, and as Queen Victoria of Great Britain noted, they were spoken of with genuine fondness throughout Europe as Good Fritz and Louise of Baden. They had transformed a marriage of state into a true union of hearts, creating a domestic happiness that was the envy of many of their royal contemporaries. But Louise's ambitions extended beyond the walls of her palace. She was about to find a public calling that would define her life and create her most lasting legacy. In 1859, the peace of Europe was shattered. The Second Italian War of Independence erupted, pitting the Austrian Empire against the allied forces of France and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Though Baden was not a direct combatant initially, the conflict sent shockwaves through the German Confederation. Baden mobilized its army to defend the Confederation's western border, and the grim realities of modern warfare were brought home. Reports from the front were horrific. The Battle of Solferino in particular was a bloodbath of unprecedented scale, leaving tens of thousands of wounded and dying men abandoned on the battlefield. Louise, now a 21-year-old mother, was deeply moved and horrified by the stories of suffering. The primitive state of military medical care meant that a wound was often a death sentence. While others saw this as an unavoidable tragedy of war, Louise saw it as an unacceptable failure of human compassion and organization. This moment was her crucible. The Prussian sense of duty instilled by her father, combined with the social conscience nurtured by her mother, ignited within her. She refused to be a passive spectator. With a surge of energy and determination that surprised many, she decided to act. In that same year, 1859, she founded the Badischer Frauenverein, the Baden Women's Association. This was not merely another aristocratic charity, a way for wealthy ladies to pass the time. It was a revolutionary concept. Louise envisioned a nationwide, centrally organized network dedicated to training nurses, establishing hospitals, and providing relief not just to soldiers in wartime, but to civilians in times of peace. Her vision was to professionalize the work of compassion, to transform it from haphazard individual acts of kindness into a disciplined, effective social force. She threw herself into the work with incredible dedication. She was not just a royal patron in name, she was the association's chief architect and driving force. She drafted statutes, established a central committee in Karlsruhe, and personally encouraged the formation of branches in towns and villages throughout the Grand Duchy. She understood that success depended on organization and training. Under her leadership, the Frauenverein began to train volunteer nurses, creating a reserve of skilled caregivers that the state had previously lacked. In this endeavor, she was at the absolute forefront of a new global movement. Her work ran parallel to that of the celebrated Florence Nightingale in Britain, with whom she corresponded and exchanged ideas. It also predated and perfectly aligned with the vision of the Swiss businessman Henry Dunant, whose own horror at the suffering in Solferino would lead him, a few years later, to propose the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Louise became one of his earliest and most influential supporters. The Baden Women's Association, under her guidance, would eventually become a cornerstone of the German Red Cross. This was her life's great work. It gave her a profound sense of purpose that transcended her royal duties. She had found a way to serve that was uniquely her own. She had taken the strict discipline of her Prussian heritage and applied it to the cause of compassion, creating an institution that would save countless lives and alleviate immeasurable suffering for decades to come. She had moved out from the shadow of the throne to cast a long and benevolent shadow of her own. As the 1860s dawned, bringing with them the looming storms of the German wars of unification, both her family ties and her great humanitarian project would be tested as never before. In 1862, a political crisis in Berlin brought that man to the forefront of history. King Wilhelm I of Prussia, Louise's father, found himself locked in a bitter struggle with the liberal-dominated parliament over military reforms. Frustrated and on the verge of abdication, he took one last gamble, appointing a man known for his arch-conservative views and his utter contempt for liberalism, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's appointment sent a shockwave through the German states and indeed through the Hohenzollern family itself. He was a man of immense intellect, charm, and brutal political cunning. Shortly after taking office, he delivered his infamous speech, a declaration of intent that would define the era. The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, he thundered, but by iron and blood. For Louise, Bismarck's ascent was a source of profound personal and political conflict. It placed her squarely in the middle of a painful family schism. On one side stood her father, King Wilhelm, who, despite his initial misgivings, grew to trust and rely on Bismarck implicitly, seeing him as the only man who could secure Prussia's destiny. On the other side stood her beloved brother, Crown Prince Frederick Fritz, and his equally liberal wife, Princess Victoria. They despised Bismarck, viewing him as a cynical reactionary who was destroying any hope for a unified Germany built on constitutional and liberal principles. Their home was the center of opposition to the Iron Chancellor. Louise, now the Grand Duchess of a proudly liberal southern state, shared her brother's anxieties. She saw the danger in Bismarck's confrontational style and feared where his aggressive policies would lead. Yet, she was also her father's daughter, bound by love and a deep-seated sense of dynastic loyalty. From her vantage point in Karlsruhe, she watched the storm clouds gather over Berlin, torn between the two poles of her identity, the liberal sovereign of Baden and the loyal daughter of Prussia. The first test of this balancing act came sooner than anyone expected. In 1864, Bismarck initiated his first war, a joint Prussian-Austrian invasion of Denmark to seize the disputed duchies of Schleswig-Holstein. For the Prussian army, it was a swift and decisive victory, a chance to test the very military reforms that had caused the political crisis in the first place. For Louise, it was the first time the work of her Badischer Frauenverein was truly put to the test on a national scale. Though Baden was not a combatant, The wounded from the war were transported throughout the German states. Her organization mobilized, sending supplies, bandages, and trained nurses to care for the soldiers. It was a grim foreshadowing of the much larger conflicts to come, and her first experience of trying to heal the wounds inflicted by the policies of her own family's government. Bismarck had never seen the war against Denmark as an end in itself. It was merely a prelude, a way to engineer his true goal, a final decisive confrontation with Austria for dominance over the German states. For centuries, the Habsburgs of Austria had been the traditional leaders of the German world. Bismarck knew that for Prussia to rise, Austria must be brought low. By 1866, through a series of masterful and duplicitous diplomatic maneuvers concerning the administration of the newly conquered duchies, he provoked Austria into war. The conflict that erupted in the summer of 1866 was a German tragedy, a Bruderkrieg, or War of Brothers. It pitted German against German, state against state. Most of the southern and central German states, including Baden, Hanover, and Bavaria, honored their obligations to the German Confederation and sided with Austria, fearing Prussian domination. For Louise, this was the ultimate nightmare brought to life. The abstract political tensions had now become a terrifying reality. Her adopted homeland, Baden, was officially at war with her native land, Prussia. Her husband, Grand Duke Frederick, was now the military enemy of her father, King Wilhelm. The soldiers her husband commanded were arrayed against the armies, led by her own father and brother. It is impossible to overstate the agonizing torment this must have caused her. She was caught in an impossible vice of conflicting loyalties. In Karlsruhe, some hardliners may have viewed her with suspicion, a Prussian princess in their midst. In Berlin, some may have seen her as having gone native in the liberal South. Her husband's position was equally fraught. Grand Duke Frederick was no Prussian-hating reactionary. He was a pragmatist who privately believed that German unity under Prussian leadership was inevitable and even desirable. But he was also a man of honor, bound by treaty to the German Confederation. He could not stand idly by while Prussia aggressively dismantled the existing order. With a heavy heart, he committed Baden's forces to the Austrian cause, a decision driven by duty rather than conviction. The war itself was shockingly swift. The Prussian army, newly equipped with breech-loading needle guns and utilizing railways for rapid mobilization, was a modern fighting force unlike anything Europe had seen. On July 3, 1866, at the Battle of Königgrätz in Bohemia, the Prussian army utterly shattered the main Austrian force. In a single bloody afternoon, the war was effectively decided. The 7-week conflict was over, and Prussia was the undisputed master of Germany. Baden's army had seen little action, but the state was now on the losing side, at the mercy of Bismarck and the victorious Prussian king. Many in Baden feared the worst: annexation, a punitive indemnity that would bankrupt the state, or the humiliation of a military occupation. This was the moment where Louise's unique position became her greatest asset. While official diplomatic channels were frozen, she was the one person who could bridge the gap between the victor and the vanquished. She was the vital personal link between Karlsruhe and Berlin. While there is no single document proving her intervention, it is widely believed by historians that she played a crucial behind-the-scenes role. She wrote urgent, heartfelt letters to her father, King Wilhelm, pleading for leniency for her husband and her adopted country. She would have reminded him that Frederick's actions were born of honor, not animosity, and that a harsh peace would only breed resentment, making future German unity impossible. Her father, who adored his only daughter, would have been receptive to her appeals. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, also saw the wisdom in this. He didn't want a sullen, resentful Baden on France's doorstep. He wanted a loyal, grateful ally for his next final confrontation. The result was a peace treaty that was remarkably mild. Baden had to pay a small indemnity and sign a secret defensive pact with Prussia, but its sovereignty was respected, its territory intact. Louise, through her quiet diplomacy and personal appeal, had likely saved her new home from the conqueror's wrath. She had turned a moment of profound personal crisis into an act of statesmanship, proving that the bonds of family could be as powerful as any treaty. The Austro-Prussian War had created a new reality. Prussia annexed many of its northern German opponents and formed the North German Confederation, a powerful new state. The southern states, Baden, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained independent but were now tied to Prussia by military alliances. Bismarck knew that only one thing could persuade these proud, independent states to voluntarily merge into a single German empire, a common external threat. And that threat was France. Under Emperor Napoleon III, France watched Prussia's meteoric rise with alarm and jealousy. It was only a matter of time before a spark would ignite the powder keg. In 1870, Bismarck found his spark. A dispute over the succession to the Spanish throne, skillfully manipulated by the Iron Chancellor through the infamous Ems dispatch, goaded France into declaring war on Prussia on July 19th, 1870. This time, everything was different. The common enemy on their borders galvanized German nationalism as nothing had before. Invoking their defensive pacts, the southern German states, including Baden, immediately joined Prussia. For Louise, this must have been a moment of profound vindication and relief. The agonizing conflict of 1866 was over. Her two homes, her two families, were now united, fighting side by side in a common cause. The war also thrust her and her life's work into the very center of the action. The main theater of war was directly across the Rhine, in Alsace and Lorraine. Baden was transformed into a massive staging ground, and more importantly, a vast rear hospital for the German armies. The Badischer Frauenverein, which Louise had been building and perfecting for over a decade, was now called upon for the ultimate test. It rose to the occasion magnificently. Louise became the angel of the German Southwest, the tireless organizer and comforting presence for the thousands of wounded who poured back across the Rhine. She oversaw the conversion of schools, castles, and public buildings in Karlsruhe, Mannheim, and Freiburg into military hospitals, or lazarettos. Her organization, with its network of trained nurses and volunteers, was indispensable, but her role was not merely administrative. She was a constant hands-on presence. She would personally visit the hospitals, moving from bed to bed, speaking words of comfort to grievously wounded soldiers. She was known to sit with dying men, writing final letters to their families, with her own hand. Crucially, her compassion extended to the enemy. She insisted that the French prisoners of war in her hospitals receive the same level of care as the German soldiers, a testament to her profound humanitarianism, which saw the suffering man, not the uniform. Tragically, while she was surrounded by the national drama of war and the personal drama of the hospitals, a private sorrow struck her family. In 1871, during the final stages of the war, her youngest son, the bright and beloved Prince Ludwig Wilhelm, died of diphtheria at the age of 6. To lose a child while surrounded by so much death and destruction was a particularly cruel blow, one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, the war progressed with stunning speed. The German armies were victorious at Gravelotte, at Sedan, where they captured Emperor Napoleon III himself, and laid siege to Paris. The triumph was total. In the patriotic fervor of this shared victory, The southern German states agreed to join the North German Confederation to create a new, unified German Empire. On January 18, 1871, in a moment dripping with historical irony and symbolism, the leaders of the German states gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the former seat of French royal power. There, amidst the cheers of princes and generals, her father, King Wilhelm I of Prussia, was proclaimed the first German emperor. Standing near him were her husband, Grand Duke Frederick, and her brother, Crown Prince Fritz. Louise was not there. She was back in Karlsruhe, still overseeing her hospitals, still tending to the broken bodies that were the price of this victory. For her, the news of the empire's birth must have been a complex mixture of emotions: immense pride in her father, relief at the realization of the dream of national unity, but also a profound and intimate understanding of the terrible human cost of that dream. She had seen up close the blood and iron, and she had dedicated her life to healing the wounds they left behind. She had entered the decade as a princess caught between two worlds. She emerged from it as the Kaiser, the emperor's daughter, a revered national figure, a symbol not only of the new empire's unity, but of its conscience. The years of war were over, and an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity for Germany was about to begin. But for Louise, this new imperial age would bring with it a new set of challenges, fought not on the battlefield, but within the gilded halls of the court and the private chambers of her own family. The proclamation of the German Empire at Versailles in 1871 was not merely the end of a war, it was the dawn of a new age. The Kaiserreich, as the new state was known, exploded onto the European stage with astonishing vigor. A wave of patriotic euphoria swept the nation, accompanied by an unprecedented economic boom. This was the Gründerzeit, the founders' era. Money, industry, and confidence flowed through the new Germany. Berlin was transformed from a provincial Prussian capital into a bustling imperial metropolis, a rival to London and Paris. In this new, powerful, and often arrogant empire, Louise, the Grand Duchess of Baden, occupied a uniquely influential position. She was now the Kaiser, the only daughter of the revered German emperor, Wilhelm I. This status conferred upon her, and by extension, upon the Grand Duchy of Baden, immense prestige. Her husband, the wise and respected Grand Duke Frederick, was now one of the most senior and influential princes of the realm. Their marriage, once a strategic move to bind a southern state to Prussia, was now the symbolic union at the very heart of the new empire. The couple from Karlsruhe often acted as the emperor's representatives, undertaking diplomatic missions and attending royal functions across the continent, from the court of St. James's to the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg. In Baden, Louise resumed her duties with renewed purpose. The court of Karlsruhe flourished, becoming a significant cultural center. She continued her patronage of the arts, supported educational institutions, and poured her energy into expanding the work of her beloved Frauenverein. Having proven its indispensable value during the wars, the association was now a permanent and integral part of the National German Red Cross, focusing on public health, disaster relief, and nurse training in peacetime. Louise had become one of Germany's foremost humanitarians, her work a model of organized social welfare. Life was, on the surface, a picture of imperial success and domestic contentment, but beneath the glittering facade of the new empire, a deep ideological battle was being waged for its very soul. And at the center of this struggle was Louise's own family. The imperial court in Berlin was not a monolithic entity. It was, in fact, two distinct and competing courts, each with a radically different vision for Germany's future. The first was the Old Court, the official center of power. It revolved around the aging Emperor Wilhelm I and his formidable Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. While Wilhelm provided imperial legitimacy and stability, Bismarck was the true political master of the new Germany. Having created the empire through blood and iron, he was determined to govern it with the same pragmatic and authoritarian hand. He distrusted democracy, despised parliamentary opposition, and saw liberalism as a dangerous, destabilizing force. His primary goal was to consolidate the power of the monarchy and the state, crushing any group he perceived as a threat. This led him to launch the Kulturkampf, culture struggle, a harsh campaign against the political influence of the Catholic Church, and later to pass anti-socialist laws. This was the court of power, tradition, and conservative pragmatism. The second court existed just a short walk away, at the Crown Prince's palace. This was the vibrant intellectual and social world of Louise's brother, Crown Prince Frederick, Fritz, and his brilliant, strong-willed wife, Victoria, the Princess Royal of Great Britain. Their home was a haven for artists, scientists, and liberal thinkers. Both Fritz and Vicky were profoundly influenced by the British model of constitutional monarchy. They dreamed of a Germany that was not only powerful, but also free. They envisioned an empire where the Kaiser would reign, not rule, where Parliament would have real power, and where individual liberties would be protected by law. They were appalled by Bismarck's authoritarian methods, viewing the Kulturkampf as a barbaric throwback and his persecution of political opponents as a stain on the new nation's honor. Theirs was the court of hope, progress, and liberal idealism. Bismarck, in turn, viewed the Crown Prince's circle with deep suspicion and contempt. He saw their Anglophilia as un-German, their liberalism as naive, and he particularly loathed the Crown Princess Victoria, whom he regarded as a dangerous foreign radical poisoning his future emperor. The animosity between the Chancellor and the Crown Prince's couple was one of the great political dramas of the era. Once again, Louise and her husband found themselves in the role of mediators. Their hearts were firmly with Fritz and Vicky. They shared their liberal aspirations and were deeply troubled by Bismarck's dominance. The court in Karlsruhe became a sort of southern outpost of the Crown Prince's liberal circle. However, Louise was also a deeply loyal daughter. She revered her father, the emperor, and understood the need for stability in the new empire. Grand Duke Frederick, respected by all parties for his integrity, became a crucial intermediary. He was one of the few men who could speak frankly to Wilhelm I and even to Bismarck without being dismissed, often working behind the scenes to temper the Chancellor's harshest policies and to mend the rifts within the royal family. Louise's letters to her brother and sister-in-law during these years were filled with shared frustrations, expressions of support, and anxious discussions about the future, a constant effort to keep the flame of liberal hope alive in an increasingly authoritarian state. Amidst these high-stakes political dramas, life continued. Louise was now entering her prime, a respected matriarch presiding over her own family. Her eldest son, Frederick, was being groomed to one day inherit the Grand Ducal throne. But it was her only daughter, also named Victoria, who would soon step onto the international stage. Princess Victoria of Baden was a strong, intelligent, and spirited young woman. As she came of age, a suitable marriage became a priority. A truly brilliant match was found: Crown Prince Gustav of Sweden and Norway. He was the heir to the Bernadotte dynasty, a house founded by one of Napoleon's marshals, and was in need of the legitimacy that a marriage into one of Germany's oldest ruling families could provide. For the new German Empire, the match was equally valuable, creating a powerful link to the Scandinavian kingdoms. The wedding, which took place in Karlsruhe in 1881, was a major European event, attended by Louise's father, the emperor himself. It was a personal triumph for Louise. She had successfully navigated the complex world of royal matchmaking to secure a crown for her daughter. This union cemented her status as one of the great royal mothers-in-law of her time, on par with Queen Victoria of Great Britain. The bond between Louise and her daughter remained exceptionally close, and Victoria would go on to be a formidable and influential Queen of Sweden, shaped by the strong character and sense of duty she had learned from her mother. As the 1880s wore on, the German Empire seemed to be an unshakable edifice of power and permanence. But its founder, Emperor Wilhelm I, was now nearing his 90th birthday. His health, remarkably robust for his age, was finally beginning to fail. The entire nation, and indeed all of Europe, held its breath, waiting for the inevitable transition of power. The era of Bismarck and the old king was ending. The era of the liberal Emperor Frederick III was about to begin. It was the dawn that liberals across Germany had been praying for over 2 decades. But fate had a cruelly ironic twist in store. In the spring of 1887, just as he stood on the threshold of power, Crown Prince Frederick was diagnosed with a persistent hoarseness. The diagnosis was devastating: cancer of the larynx. The news plunged the family and the nation into a state of crisis. A bitter and highly politicized medical debate erupted. German doctors advised an immediate radical surgery to remove the larynx, which would save his life but leave him permanently voiceless. His wife Victoria, backed by her mother, Queen Victoria of Great Britain, instead placed her trust in a leading British throat specialist, Sir Morrell Mackenzie. Mackenzie believed the growth might not be cancerous and advocated for less invasive treatments. For months, the prince's health was the subject of intense public speculation and vicious court intrigue. The Bismarckian camp and the nationalist press launched a vile campaign against Crown Princess Victoria, accusing her of sacrificing her husband's life and Germany's future out of a misplaced trust in a foreign doctor. For Louise, watching this unfold was an agony. Her beloved brother, the repository of all her political and familial hopes, was not only dying, but his suffering was being used as a political weapon. She traveled to be with him, offering what comfort she could, a helpless witness to the impending tragedy. On March 9, 1888, Emperor Wilhelm I died peacefully at the age of 90. Her brother Fritz, now a dying man, became Emperor Frederick III. His reign was one of the most tragic in modern history. Communicating only by writing, a silent emperor on a throne of pain, he tried desperately to enact the changes he had dreamed of for so long. He dismissed conservative ministers, pardoned political prisoners, and signaled a new liberal direction for the empire. It was a heroic, heartbreaking race against time. The race was lost. After just 99 agonizing days, on June 15, 1888, Emperor Frederick III died. With him died the great hope for a liberal German empire. It was a catastrophe for the nation and an unspeakable personal blow for Louise. The brother who had been her confidant, her ally, her entire life, was gone. The future they had imagined together had vanished. The throne passed instantly to her nephew, Frederick's 29-year-old son, who now became Kaiser Wilhelm II. The new emperor was the antithesis of his father. Impetuous, arrogant, and insecure, he was filled with a deep resentment for his parents and their liberal English ideas. He was a staunch believer in his own divine right to rule and was determined to set Germany on a bold, aggressive new course. The era of caution and moderation was over. The era of Wilhelm II had begun. For Louise, the year that had begun with the death of her revered father ended with the death of her beloved brother and the ascension of a nephew whose character and policies filled her with deep apprehension. The empire her father had founded and her brother had hoped to reform was now in the hands of an unpredictable young man. She was now one of the last of the founding generation, a grand old dame of the empire, destined to live out her remaining years as a Cassandra, a living relic of a more hopeful past, watching as the Germany she loved began its fateful march towards an unknown and dangerous future. The death of the liberal emperor, Frederick III, in 1888, was more than a family tragedy. It was a profound turning point in the history of Germany. The 99-day reign had been a fleeting glimpse of a different path, a path that was now forever closed. The ascension of his 29-year-old son, Kaiser Wilhelm II, marked the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter. The Wilhelmian era was one of jarring contradictions. Germany grew into an industrial, scientific, and military powerhouse, its cities booming, its technology the envy of the world. But this dynamic modernism was shackled to a political culture that was increasingly archaic. The new Kaiser was a man of the past, a fervent believer in his own divine right to rule, a neo-absolutist who was dangerously out of step with the times. He was intelligent, but emotionally unstable, insecure, yet fantastically arrogant. He dismissed his father's liberal ideals as weak and un-German, and chafed under the cautious guidance of the old Chancellor, Bismarck, whom he would famously drop the pilot and force into retirement in 1890. Wilhelm II envisioned a new destiny for Germany, Weltpolitik, or world policy. Germany would no longer be a satiated power content to manage the balance of Europe. It would demand its place in the sun. This meant building a massive high seas fleet to challenge Great Britain's naval supremacy, pursuing colonial ambitions, and engaging in a style of diplomacy that was erratic, aggressive, and deeply unsettling to its neighbors. For Louise, now in her 50s and the senior female member of the imperial family, this new era was a source of constant and grave concern. She was now the grand old dame of the German Empire, a living link to its founding fathers, her own father, and the brother she had lost. She was revered throughout Germany as a symbol of the old virtues, dignity, duty, and quiet moderation. From her court in Karlsruhe, which remained a bastion of liberal culture and thought, she watched her nephew's reign with the apprehension of someone who understood the foundations of the empire he was so carelessly shaking. Her relationship with Wilhelm II was outwardly correct and familial, but inwardly strained. He treated his aunt with the formal respect her position demanded, but he had little patience for her moderating influence or the liberal world she represented. She, in turn, saw in his bombastic speeches and impetuous actions a terrifying echo of the very Prussian arrogance her brother had fought so hard to temper. She was the keeper of a memory he wished to forget, the memory of a gentler, more liberal vision for Germany. The greatest personal blow of this era came in September 1907. Her husband, her partner of more than half a century, Grand Duke Frederick I, died at the age of 81. Theirs had been one of the great royal love stories of the age, a union that began in political calculation and deepened into 51 years of mutual devotion and companionship. His death was the end of an era for Baden, and for Louise, it was an immeasurable personal loss. She was now a widow, left to face the growing darkness of the new century alone, the matriarch of her family, and a lonely sentinel of a fading past. As the new century progressed, the atmosphere in Europe grew thick with suspicion and fear. A rigid system of alliances had divided the continent into two armed camps: the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Great Britain on one side, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. A frantic arms race, particularly the naval race between Germany and Britain, consumed national budgets and fueled public paranoia. A series of escalating international crises, in Morocco and the Balkans, pushed the great powers closer and closer to the brink. Louise, with her vast experience and unique network of family connections, was better positioned than most to see the impending danger. Her daughter, Victoria, was the powerful and influential Queen of Sweden. Her Romanov relatives sat on the throne of Russia, and her Coburg relatives on the throne of Great Britain. Her world was a web of interlocking dynasties, a family of cousins and in-laws who now ruled over nations armed to the teeth and consumed by mutual distrust. She became a Cassandra-like figure, a prophetess of a doom that the younger generation, drunk on nationalism and dreams of glory, could not see. Her generation had known war. She had walked through the hospitals, sat with the dying, and understood the true price of blood and iron. She had seen how her father and Bismarck had carefully preserved the peace for decades after 1871, and she now watched in horror as her nephew, through his arrogance and incompetence, systematically dismantled that legacy, isolating Germany and leading it toward a confrontation it could not win. The long, peaceful Victorian and Wilhelmian summer was ending, and a terrible autumn was about to begin. The spark came on June 28, 1914, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo. The assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, set off a chain reaction that no one could control. The alliance system, meant to preserve peace, instead became a conveyor belt to war. In the feverish days of the July crisis, ultimatums and mobilizations followed one another in rapid succession. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The First World War had begun. For Louise, now 75 years old, this was the apocalypse. It was the absolute negation of her life's work and the suicidal self-destruction of the European civilization she had known. This was not a limited cabinet war like the ones of her youth. It was a total industrial-scale conflict that pitted nations and empires against each other in a struggle for survival. It was a war of cousins. Willie, Georgie, and Nicky, the leaders of Germany, Britain, and Russia, all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, were leading their people into a fratricidal slaughter. Despite her age and her despair, her sense of duty was undimmed. The moment war was declared, she mobilized the vast network of the Baden Red Cross. The organization she had founded as a young woman more than 50 years earlier was now called upon for its greatest and most terrible duty. Once more, she became a figure of national resilience, a comforting link to a more stable past. She oversaw the establishment of hospitals, organized relief efforts, and, as she had done so many times before, she visited the wounded. But the sheer scale of the carnage was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. The casualty lists from battles like the Somme and Verdun were incomprehensible, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The young men of Germany were being fed into a meat grinder. As the war dragged on, year after bloody year, she saw her beloved Germany slowly bleed to death, not only on the battlefields but on the home front, where starvation and hardship took a terrible toll. The proud, prosperous empire she had known was being ground into dust. By the autumn of 1918, Germany was broken. Its armies were in retreat, its people were starving, and its spirit was crushed. The High Command was forced to admit defeat and seek an armistice. The news that the war was lost unleashed all the pent-up anger and frustration of the German people. Revolution swept through the country. On November 9th, 1918, the monarchy collapsed. In Berlin, a republic was proclaimed. Kaiser Wilhelm II, her nephew, the last German emperor, was forced to abdicate and flee into ignominious exile in Holland. Within days, all the other ruling princes of Germany followed suit. In Karlsruhe, Louise's grandson, Grand Duke Frederick II, renounced the throne of Baden. The House of Zeringen, which had ruled for over 800 years, was no more. The Hohenzollern Empire, which her father had founded less than 50 years before, had vanished in a puff of smoke. Every crown in Germany had tumbled into the dust. In the midst of this chaos, Louise, now an 80-year-old woman, displayed a final remarkable act of the fortitude that had defined her life. As revolutionaries approached the palace in Karlsruhe, she faced the collapse of her entire world with an almost supernatural calm. It was reported that as her family was forced to flee their home, she remained composed and dignified, never uttering a single word of complaint or self-pity. She had lived her life by the old Prussian code of duty and stoicism, and she would face the end of that life with the same unshakable discipline. The new social democratic government of the Weimar Republic, as the new state would be called, treated the revered old Grand Duchess with respect, recognizing her immense contributions and her status as a national icon. They allowed her to live out her remaining years in quiet retirement at a residence in Baden-Baden. Louise spent the last 5 years of her life as a living relic in a world she no longer recognized. The German Empire was gone, replaced by a struggling democratic republic burdened by the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Europe of kings and emperors had been swept away, its place taken by new nations and new uncertain ideologies. From her home in Baden-Baden, she watched and reflected. She was visited by her daughter, Queen Victoria of Sweden, a link to her past life. Those who met her in these final years described a woman who, despite her age, remained mentally sharp, her will of iron undiminished. She had witnessed the birth of the mighty German Empire, lived through its era of unparalleled power, and now survived its fiery death. She died peacefully on April 23, 1923, at the age of 84. The life of Louise of Prussia is, in the end, a powerful refutation of the simple, tragic princess myth. She was not a victim of history. She was an active, resilient, and profoundly influential participant. Faced with the constraints of a political marriage, she forged a partnership of love and respect that lasted a lifetime. Bound by the duties of her royal station, she channeled that duty into a pioneering humanitarian mission that saved countless lives and left a lasting institutional legacy. Caught in the cross-currents of war and family conflict, she served as a voice of moderation and a tireless agent of compassion. Her legacy is not written in grand treaties or etched onto victory monuments. It is a quieter, more human legacy, found in the foundations of the German Red Cross, in the memory of a happy and dignified royal court, and in the example of a life that proved that strength does not have to be loud, that duty can be a source of purpose, and that a life of service can also be a life of profound fulfillment. In the grand, often tragic opera of German history, Louise's story is a quiet, noble aria of love, resilience, and enduring grace.